I want to talk about Certes. Certes is the counterpart to qualia, so let's talk about qualia first. Many of you will have already heard of qualia, but I'm going to give a more technical definition. Qualia is any emergent property or thing that exists exclusively as a byproduct of interaction. So if I clap my hands together, that's an interaction. There is a byproduct of that interaction, which is the shock wave. There's the sound waves that propagate through the air, which is also just a bunch of interactions. It interacts with my eardrum. My eardrum interacts by sending signals to my brain. My brain interacts by having all the neurons fire, and then I experience sound, the sound of the hands clapping. So all of that is qualia. It's all just emergent properties stemming from interaction. Certes would be anything that has properties outside of interaction, any property or thing that exists outside of interaction. When you first start thinking about these concepts, you would ascribe qualia as being the byproduct of interaction, whereas when you talk about Certes, you would say, now Certes, that's the actual thing. That's the real thing. That's what's doing the interaction. Whereas qualia, that's kind of like not real. It's just the byproduct of interaction. What we want to find out, if you're doing like reductionism and you want to reduce things down to their primal, absolute baseline properties, then you would have this idea where it's like, okay, there's something out there, something that exists outside of interaction, and if we can reduce enough, we will find it. And then we will know the secrets to the universe. We will know what reality is actually made of, and what the fundamental axioms need to be. Reductionism requires you to interact with things. So if you're trying to use interaction to find Certes, then what you're essentially trying to do is you're trying to look at interaction in order to infer what the properties are of the thing that exists outside of interaction, which that is quite troubling because you probably can't do that. Well, you definitely can't do that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So right here, in this little picture here, we're going to It just shows you reducing a sandcastle. So the sandcastle is qualia. It's made out of a bunch of little sandstones interacting together. Well, okay, so is that the Certes? Absolutely not. These sandstones are they're made out of little tiny crystals, right? And if you look really closely, the different parts of the crystal, they'll be interacting with each other, just as matter does. Even when matter is stationary, it's still technically interacting with each other. You reduce that down, you get atoms. Well, okay. Is atoms Certes? No, atoms, that's just more qualia. It's more interactions. So you reduce again, and you just get more interactions. The atomic nucleus is just the interactions of the nucleon within the nucleon. And then you reduce that, and then you get down to quarks. Right, and then once you get really far down, they're like, all right, we're so close. We are so close. We're going to find it. We're going to find the Certes. We're going to see what it is that's actually doing all of this interaction. And then, lo and behold, you get all the way down there, and shit starts interacting with itself. In quantum mechanics, if you try very hard to get something to be completely on its own, where it's not interacting with anything, it will just defy all logic and start vibrating, becoming a wave, and then it'll just interact with itself somehow. This obviously makes reductionism very difficult. And then, of course, if you try to interact with that wave, it will collapse. So you're like, okay, well, it's interacting with itself. What does that look like? You try to look in, you try to get a closer look. Well, now you're interacting with it, so it doesn't need to interact with itself. There's a video that Michael from Vsauce made called Do Chairs Exist? I highly recommend you watch that. He talks about reducing a chair down to its fundamental parts, kind of like how I reduced the sandcastle down. He talks about the problems with that, and he also talks about something called simples, which when he's talking about simples, it's the same as Certes, but simples can only refer to it from a physics perspective, whereas the word Certes is more broad. So, for example, someone could believe that their political ideology contains Certes. They could believe that, well, my political ideology, it contains truth outside of any form of context, outside of any form of application. Those are just types of interaction. Outside of any interaction, my political ideology contains absolute truth. Religious people can also believe that their religion holds absolute truth outside of interaction. So Certes it doesn't have to just refer to physics. Certes is literally just anything or any property that exists outside of interaction. Now, in the Vsauce video, Michael, again, he does a fantastic job displaying like the mentality you have to have when trying to do reductionism. But then he gets a little bit caught up in the end about simples, and he ends up making the wrong conclusion in that video, or at least moving in the wrong direction. And this is because there is no such thing as Certes. Certes is an invalid concept that evolved into our brains because we are hunter-gatherers, and it's very useful for a hunter-gatherer species to sort of project this idea that, you know, a berry bush is going to be in the same place once you go back. And if it's not, then there's, you know, something's going on. That's very useful. And it's also correct that, that does reflect reality. But that type of, because like when you project that type of objectiveness onto reality as a hunter gatherer, while it is useful, it stops being useful when you're trying to reduce the universe down to its fundamental principles. So, in order to understand that existence it's actually literally made out of the complete and absolute absence of Certes. It's kind of weird to think about, but reality is made out of Certes not being real. That's why when you try to get a particle or as far away from interacting with anything at all, it starts to interact with itself, because that's what reality is. Reality is this constantly shifting weird thing that never allows Certes to exist. And it's not that Certes exists, but it's out of reach. It's like it's there, but we just can't see it. It literally does not exist at all. And all functions of reality will again warp and change before your very eyes just to ensure that it continues to not exist. So now obviously that will lead us to the question of, okay, if there is no Certes, then what's doing the interaction? And the answer to that question is very simple. It's just also interaction. Interaction interacts with interaction, interacting with interaction. Existence is made out of this really weird, almost eldritch feedback loop. I have another video where I talk about time-space as compared to space-time, and I go into more detail about how it exactly works. Basically, there can be these two sides of reality, and each side of reality can simulate the other side. I also did a video on psychedelics and how psychedelics and also just intense meditation, although it's a lot more difficult to go down that route, they can help you break free from the baseline framework on which our hunter-gatherer brains are built on top of, and they can allow you to perceive reality in a new light, specifically a new light that is far more compatible with the true nature of existence. Existence is the absence of Certes. Certes is any property outside interaction. Interaction is a presence. Properties outside interaction are absent. Therefore, Certes is absence, and existence is the absence of absence. Join the cult.